If you want to cross this bridge, you pay the fee. That is how it works around here. I stood at the edge of my own property, looking at a woman I had never met, who was telling me I could not access land I legally owned without paying her $50. The sign behind her was new. I knew it was new because I had built this bridge 4 months ago, and there had been no sign then. Toll bridge, $50 per crossing. Pay to Elk Ridge Community Fund. She held a clipboard like it were a badge of authority. She smiled like someone who had done this many times before. And she had no idea that the man standing in front of her had spent 15 years designing bridges for the Colorado Department of Transportation. This was not going to go the way she expected. Today's story features one of the most absurd confrontations I have ever covered on this channel. A man drives up to his property in the Colorado mountains. He approaches the bridge that spans the creek and crosses onto his land. And standing there, blocking his path, is a woman with a clipboard. She points to a sign nailed to the railing. Toll bridge, $50 per crossing. Pay to Elk Ridge Community Fund. She tells him he cannot access his own property without paying her. Here is the twist. He built that bridge, with his own hands, on his own land. She is demanding a toll for a bridge she had nothing to do with. What happens next is a masterclass in patience, documentation, and knowing when to fight back. If you are new to Fallout HOA, drop a comment below and let me know where you are watching from. The drive up to Elk Ridge had become my favorite part of the week. 37 miles of winding mountain road, pine trees on both sides, the occasional glimpse of snow-capped peaks in the distance. My name is Edward Cross. I spent 15 years as a bridge engineer for the Colorado Department of Transportation before leaving to start my own consulting firm. 6 months ago, I purchased 45 acres of mountain property, including Crystal Lake, a place where I could build something for myself instead of for someone else. The old bridge that crossed Pine Creek had collapsed 2 years before I bought the land. Most buyers walked away because of that. I saw an opportunity. I designed and built a new bridge myself, 30 feet across a shallow creek, 6 weeks of work. Every bolt was driven by my own hands. When it was finished, I felt something I had not felt in years. Pride in something that was entirely mine. That was 4 months ago. Today. I pulled my truck around the last bend before the creek crossing and saw something that made me ease off the gas. There was a sign on my bridge. Not a small sign. A large white board with red letters nailed directly to the railing I had built. I stopped the truck about 50 feet away and read it through my windshield. Toll bridge, $50 per crossing. Pay to Elk Ridge Community Fund. Below the text was a P.O. box number. No address, no phone number, no website. Just a P.O. box and a hand-drawn logo that looked like it had been designed in a word processor. Standing in front of the sign, arms crossed, and a clipboard pressed against her chest, was a woman I had never seen before. I pulled up to the bridge entrance and rolled down my window. She stepped forward with a practiced smile. Early 60s. Silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, wearing a fleece vest with the same crude logo embroidered on the chest. Good afternoon. I am Heather Thornton, Community Coordinator for Elk Ridge. Before you cross, I will need to collect the toll fee, $50 for vehicle crossing, or you can purchase a monthly pass for $200, which includes unlimited crossings and bridge maintenance coverage. She said it like she was reciting from a script, like this was the most normal transaction in the world. I looked at the sign, then back at her. I am sorry. What? She maintained her smile. The toll fee, $50. All bridges in the Elk Ridge community are maintained through our community fund. This ensures safe passage for all residents and visitors. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not anger, not yet. Something closer to disbelief. Ma'am, I built this bridge. Her smile did not waver. That is not relevant to the maintenance fee structure, sir. All bridges within the community access routes fall under our management jurisdiction. You might be thinking there must be some misunderstanding. Maybe there is a legitimate community organization. Maybe there are actual maintenance costs. Maybe this woman has official authority I did not know about. I thought all of those things too. For about 3 seconds. Then I looked at the sign again. The paint was fresh. The nails were new. The logo looked like clip art. And there was no contact information except a P.O. box. No registered nonprofit would operate like this. No legitimate community fund would nail a toll sign to a private bridge without so much as a letter to the property owner. There was no misunderstanding here. There was something else entirely. I had seen enough municipal dealings in my career to recognize when administrative language was being used as a weapon. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I put my truck in reverse and backed up about 20 feet, then parked on the shoulder of the county road. Heather Thornton watched me with a slight frown, clearly not expecting this response. I got out of my truck, locked it, and walked toward the bridge on foot. "I will walk across," I said as I passed her. She scribbled something on her clipboard. "Pedestrian crossing is free for first-time visitors as a courtesy, but vehicle access requires payment. And if you are a property owner in this area, you will want to get current with your maintenance fees. We have records going back several months." I stopped and turned to face her. "Records of what?" She smiled again, but this time there was something sharper underneath it. "Of property owners who have not been contributing to community infrastructure. We take our responsibilities very seriously here. Mr. She waited for me to fill in the blank. I did not give her my name. I just turned and walked across the bridge. My bridge. The one I had designed. The one I had built with materials I purchased and labor I provided. The one that was now apparently being held hostage by a woman with a clipboard and a P.O. box. If you have ever encountered someone like this, someone who invents a title, creates fake rules, and demands money for services that do not exist, you know the feeling. That mixture of outrage and absurdity. The sense that you are living inside a bureaucratic fever dream where nothing makes sense, but everyone acts like it does. I walked onto my land and stood looking at Crystal Lake in the distance. Somewhere behind me, Heather Thornton was probably writing down my license plate number, probably adding me to whatever list she maintained to track people who did not comply with her regulations. She had no idea who I was. She had no idea what I did for a living, and she certainly had no idea that she had just made the worst mistake of her career as a self-appointed community coordinator. I was not going to pay her $50. I was not going to argue with her in that moment. I was going to do what I had done for 15 years when faced with a problem. Gather information, understand the system, find the weakness, and then apply pressure in exactly the right place. I am Michael Vincent, your storyteller today here on Fallout HOA. And I want to ask you something. If you built a bridge with your own hands, on your own land, with your own money, and then a stranger showed up demanding you pay a toll every time you crossed it, what would you do? Pay the fee just to avoid trouble? Argue with her right there on the spot? Or would you do what Edward Cross did? Drop your answer in the comments below. Let us see whose strategy is the best. Thank you for being here. I walked the quarter-mile from the bridge to where my cabin stood half-finished against the tree line. The framing was complete. The roof was on. But the interior was still exposed studs and bare plywood, waiting for the work I had planned to start this month. I sat down on the front steps and looked out at Crystal Lake. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the mountains like glass. This was supposed to be my refuge. And now a woman with a clipboard was standing between me and everything I had built. The anger came in waves. I would feel calm for a few minutes, rational, and then the absurdity would hit me again, and my jaw would clench. She was charging me a toll to cross a bridge that did not exist until I created it. That single fact kept circling back. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized this was not really about me. If Heather Thornton had the confidence to stop a stranger and demand $50, she had done this before, many times, to people who did not know any better, to people who paid because they assumed she had the authority she claimed. The insult to me was secondary. The real problem was the system she had built around herself. You might be wondering why I did not just call the police. I considered it. I imagined the satisfaction of watching a deputy escort her away from my bridge. But I had worked with county governments for 15 years. I knew how that call would go. The deputy would listen, tell me it sounded like a civil matter, and suggest I consult an attorney. Heather might leave for the day, but she would be back tomorrow with the same sign and the same clipboard. Calling the police would feel good for an hour. It would not solve anything. What I needed was information. I needed to understand exactly what game she was playing before I decided how to respond. I pulled out my phone and started making a list. First, confirm the exact boundaries of my property using official plat maps from the county assessor. Second, find out what the Elk Ridge Community Fund actually was, a registered nonprofit, a homeowners association, some kind of special district with legal authority. Third, determine if Heather Thornton held any official position. Community coordinator was not a title I had encountered in 15 years of working with local governments. It sounded invented. Fourth, talk to the neighbors. If she was doing this to me, she was doing it to others. People who might have information. People who might have been paying for years without questioning anything. If you were in my position, what would you do first? Some people would go straight to a lawyer. Some would confront Heather directly and demand proof of authority. Some would pay the $50 and hope the problem disappeared. I chose none of those options. I chose to start with what I knew for certain and build outward from there. The best way to dismantle a corrupt system is not to attack it head-on. It is to understand how it works, document its weaknesses, and apply pressure at the exact point where it will collapse. That takes patience. That takes research. And it takes controlling your emotions long enough to think clearly. The next morning, I drove down the mountain to visit some neighbors. There was a small organic farm about half a mile past the turnoff to my land, owned by a woman named Elena Ruiz. I had bought eggs from her a few times. She seemed like someone who paid attention to what happened in the community. I found her in the greenhouse, transplanting seedlings into larger pots. When I explained what had happened at the bridge, she stopped working and looked at me with an expression I could not quite read. No surprise. Something more like recognition. Like she had heard this story before, or lived some version of it herself. She set down her trowel and was quiet for a long moment. You said you built that bridge yourself. The new one that went up last spring. I nodded. She exhaled slowly, staring at the seedlings in front of her. I have been paying Heather Thornton $200 a month for 5 years. Bridge maintenance fees, road upkeep, community infrastructure. She looked up at me. 5 years. That is $12,000. The number hung in the air between us. $12,000 paid to maintain a bridge that had collapsed and sat rotting in a creek until I came along and built a new one with my own money. $12,000 for services that were never rendered. For infrastructure that did not exist. Elena sat down on an overturned bucket and stared at the ground. I thought it was just how things worked around here. Everyone pays. So I paid. I never asked questions. She looked at me again, and this time there was something harder in her expression. Where has my money been going, Mr. Cross? Because it was not going to that bridge. I did not have an answer for her yet, but I was starting to understand the shape of what I was dealing with. This was not just one woman with a clipboard and an inflated sense of importance. This was a scheme, a system designed to extract money from people who did not know they had any choice but to comply. Heather Thornton had been running it for years, and until today, no one had pushed back hard enough to see how deep it went. Elena wiped her hands slowly on her apron, her eyes still fixed on the ground. $12,000, she repeated, almost to herself. I could have done so much with that money. Fixed the irrigation system, bought new equipment. Instead, it went to... She trailed off, shaking her head. When she looked up again, her expression had shifted. The confusion was still there, but underneath it was something else. The first spark of anger. I want to know where that money went. I want to know if anyone else has been paying. And I want to know what we can do about it. She stood up and faced me directly. What do you need from me? The Pitkin County Assessor's Office was located in a modest brick building in downtown Aspen, about 45 minutes from my property. I arrived when the doors opened at 8 in the morning, carrying a folder with my deed, the original survey from my purchase, and a list of questions I had written the night before. The woman at the front counter was helpful in the way that government employees sometimes are when you approach them with specific requests instead of vague complaints. I told her I needed the official plat maps for my parcel and all adjacent parcels, plus any recorded easements or right-of-way documents that might affect access to my land. She typed something into her computer, disappeared into a back room for about 10 minutes, and returned with a stack of large-format printouts. I spread the maps across a table in the public records room and started tracing boundaries. My property was designated as Parcel 47-12 in the county system. It encompassed 45 acres, including Crystal Lake and approximately 200 meters of shoreline. The western boundary followed a ridge line. The eastern boundary ran along Pine Creek for about a quarter mile before angling northeast. And here was the detail that mattered. Pine Creek formed my eastern boundary, which meant I owned the land on both sides of the creek where my bridge crossed. The bridge's western abutment sat on my property. The bridge's eastern abutment also sat on my property. The creek itself ran through my land at that point. Beyond my eastern boundary was a 30-foot county road easement, then the paved county road. There was no community property. There was no shared access zone. The bridge I had built was 100% on land that I legally owned. For those who do not know how property rights work in Colorado, let me explain something important. When you own the land on both sides of a waterway, you have the legal right to build a crossing. A bridge on private property is private infrastructure. No homeowners association, no community organization, no self-appointed coordinator has any authority to regulate it or charge fees for its use. This is not a gray area. This is settled law. The only entities that can impose tolls on bridges are government agencies with explicit statutory authority, or private owners who have established legal toll agreements with users. Heather Thornton was neither. She was a woman with a clipboard, claiming jurisdiction over something that belonged entirely to me. I photographed every map. I requested certified copies of my deed and the plat survey. Then I asked the clerk one more question. Did the county have any record of an organization called the Elk Ridge Community Fund? She typed the name into several databases while I waited. Colorado Secretary of State Business Registry, County Special District Records, nonprofit organization filings. Nothing came back. I am not finding any registered entity with that name, she said. It is not a nonprofit, not an LLC, not a special district. If it exists, it is not registered with the state. I thanked her and walked out of the building with a folder full of documents and a growing certainty about what I was dealing with. That evening, I drove to Elena's farm with the maps spread across my passenger seat. She had called me earlier in the day to say she had found something. When I arrived, she was waiting on her porch with a shoebox full of papers. Every invoice Heather ever sent me, she said, handing me the box. 5 years of monthly statements for bridge maintenance, road maintenance, and community administration fees. I sat down at her kitchen table and started going through them. The invoices were printed on plain white paper with a simple header, Elk Ridge Community Fund. Below that was a P.O. box in Aspen. No phone number, no tax ID, no physical address. Just the same crude logo I had seen on Heather's vest and on the sign nailed to my bridge. I pulled out my phone and searched the P.O. box number. It took some digging through public records, but eventually I found what I was looking for. The P.O. box was registered to a residential address on Mountain View Lane. I cross-referenced the address with the county property records I had just obtained. The property was owned by Douglas and Heather Thornton. The payments Elena had been sending for 5 years went to a P.O. box registered to Heather Thornton's personal residence, not to a community organization, not to a nonprofit with a board and oversight, to a woman's home mailbox. I showed Elena the records. She stared at them for a long time without speaking. Here is the question that kept turning in my mind. If there is no registered organization, where did the money go? If there is no legal authority, why did people keep paying? The answer to the second question was simpler than you might think. People paid because they were told to pay, because the invoices looked official, because everyone else seemed to be paying, because challenging authority feels risky, even when that authority is entirely invented. Heather Thornton had built something clever, not a legal structure, a social one, a system where compliance was assumed and questioning was discouraged. She had been collecting money for years from people who never thought to ask whether she had the right to collect it. Elena broke the silence first. How many others? How many people in Elk Ridge have been paying her? I did not know yet, but I intended to find out. I asked Elena if she knew any other property owners in the area who might have received similar invoices. She gave me 3 names. Walter Jensen, an elderly man who had lived in the area for almost 50 years. The Hendersons, a couple who own a vacation cabin near the lake. And Tom Bradshaw, a former resident who had sold his property and moved away 3 years ago. Elena did not know why Tom had left, but she remembered that it had been sudden. I wrote down the names and started planning my next conversations. The picture was becoming clearer now. Heather Thornton was not just an overzealous neighbor with boundary issues. She was running a collection operation. Fake invoices, a P.O. box tied to her personal address, no registered entity, no oversight, no accountability. The only question left was how much money she had taken and from how many people. That was what I needed to find out next, over the next 3 days. I visited every property owner I could find in the Elk Ridge area. Elena had given me 3 names to start with, and each of those conversations led to more names. By the end of the week, I had spoken to 8 families. Every single one of them had been paying Heather Thornton. Monthly fees ranging from $150 to $250, depending on the size of their property and how close they were to what Heather called community access routes. Some had been paying for 3 years, some for 7. One couple had been sending checks to that P.O. box for nearly a decade. When I added up the rough numbers based on what people told me, the total was staggering. Over 10 years. Heather Thornton had collected somewhere in the neighborhood of $120,000, maybe more. And not one of these people had ever seen a single piece of maintenance work performed on any road or bridge in the area. You might be wondering how that is possible. How could so many people pay for so long without anyone questioning it? The answer is simpler than you think. Nobody talks about money. The invoices arrived each month with official-looking headers. People assumed their neighbors were paying too. Nobody wanted to be the one who caused trouble by asking questions. And Heather had cultivated an image of community authority that made her seem legitimate. She attended county meetings. She organized a yearly potluck. She sent out newsletters about road conditions and wildlife sightings. She had built a facade of involvement that made people trust her without ever verifying whether she had actual authority over anything. It was brilliant in a predatory way, and it had worked for over a decade. The most important conversation happened on the fourth day, when I drove up a narrow dirt road to meet Walter Jensen. He was 78 years old, a retired forestry worker who had lived in Elk Ridge since 1975. His cabin was small but well-maintained, tucked into a stand of aspens with a view of the valley below. He was sitting on his porch when I pulled up, as if he had been expecting me. "You are the one who built the new bridge," he said before I could introduce myself. "I wondered when you would come asking questions." I sat down in the chair he gestured toward and told him what I had learned. The fake organization. The P.O. box is registered to Heather's home. The $120,000 collected over 10 years. He listened without surprise, nodding slowly like a man hearing confirmation of something he had suspected for a long time. "The old bridge collapsed 2 years ago," Walter said, looking out at the mountains. "Big storm came through, took out half the structure. Before that, Heather had been collecting maintenance fees for 10 years, said she was keeping the bridge safe, keeping the roads clear, but I never saw anyone do a lick of work on that bridge. Not once in 10 years. He turned to look at me directly. When it collapsed, you know what she said? She said the community fund did not have enough money to rebuild. 10 years of fees from a dozen families, and there was not enough money to fix a 30-foot wooden bridge. He shook his head slowly. Then you came along, bought the property, built a new bridge with your own hands, and now she is out there collecting fees for your bridge, like nothing ever happened. I asked Walter why he had never reported her. Why had he not called the sheriff or contacted the county? He was quiet for a moment before answering. I am 78 years old, Mr. Cross. I have lived here for almost 50 years. I do not have the energy for a fight like that. And honestly, I did not think anyone would believe me. She has connections. Her husband knows people on the county council. I figured if I made trouble, I would be the one who ended up with problems. He looked at me with something like hope in his eyes. But you are different. You are young. You have resources. And you have proof now that she has been lying to all of us. He paused. Are you going to do something about it? I told him I was still gathering information, still trying to understand the full scope of what she had built. But yes, I intended to do something about it. Walter nodded and gave me one more piece of information before I left. Talk to Tom Bradshaw if you can find him. He used to own the property on the north end of the lake. He started asking questions a few years back. Then, suddenly, he sold everything and moved away. I always wondered what happened there. I wrote down the name and thanked Walter for his time. As I drove away from his cabin, I thought about what he had said. 10 years of fees, a collapsed bridge, a fund that supposedly had no money, and a woman who was now collecting tolls on a structure she had nothing to do with. The pieces were coming together, but there was still more to find. I have to admit something here. When Heather first stopped me at that bridge, my initial instinct was to pay the $50. Just hand over the money and avoid the hassle. $200 a month was annoying, but it was not going to break me. I had the money. I could afford to make the problem go away. And that instinct, that willingness to pay for peace, is exactly what she was counting on. That is how schemes like this survive. They price themselves just low enough that fighting seems more expensive than complying. They target people who value their time and their peace of mind. They bet that nobody will ever care enough to look closely. For 10 years, that bet had paid off, but not anymore. I found Tom Bradshaw's phone number through a mutual contact in Denver. He had moved to Arizona 3 years ago and seemed surprised that anyone from Elk Ridge was calling him. When I explained what I was investigating, there was a long silence on the line. Then he spoke, his voice flat. I paid those fees for 4 years. When I started asking where the money was going, Heather told people I was a troublemaker, said I was not contributing to the community. Within a month, none of my neighbors would talk to me. I got anonymous complaints about my property. Someone reported my truck as abandoned. He paused. I sold everything and left. It was not worth it. Another pause, longer this time. You are telling me that the fund does not even legally exist? I gave that woman almost $10,000. His voice cracked slightly. I wish I had fought instead of running. The letter arrived 6 days after my conversation with Walter Jensen. It was waiting in my mailbox at the county road. A crisp white envelope with no return address except the familiar P.O. box number. I opened it standing next to my truck, the morning sun casting long shadows across the gravel. The letterhead said Elk Ridge Community Fund in bold type, with the same clip art logo I had seen on Heather's vest and the toll sign. Below that was a formal notice. Outstanding balance due, $1,200. 6 months of bridge and road maintenance fees at $200 per month. The letter stated that I had failed to register with the community fund upon purchasing my property and had accumulated a significant debt. Payment was required within 30 days. Failure to comply would result in restricted access to community infrastructure. I read that last sentence 3 times. Restricted access to community infrastructure. They were threatening to block me from using my own bridge. A bridge I had designed, a bridge I had built, on land that I owned. The letter was signed by Heather Thornton, community coordinator, with a flourish that suggested she had practiced that signature many times. There was no phone number to call, no email address, no mention of any appeals process or governing board, just a demand for money and a threat of consequences. I folded the letter carefully and put it in my folder with the rest of my documentation. Then I drove up the mountain to check on my property. This is where things escalated in a way I had not anticipated. I had assumed Heather Thornton was a nuisance, an irritant, someone who had gotten away with petty fraud for years because nobody had bothered to challenge her. I thought that once I gathered enough evidence, I could expose her scheme and the whole thing would collapse. What I did not expect was that she would escalate first, that she would move from demanding money to physically blocking access to my land. But that is exactly what happened. I came around the last bend before Pine Creek and saw the barricade. A metal gate had been installed across the bridge entrance, secured with a heavy chain and padlock. Next to it stood a new sign, larger than the toll sign, with red letters on a white background. Bridge closed for maintenance. Authorized vehicles only. Contact Elk Ridge Community Fund for access permits. And standing beside the gate, arms crossed, wearing a canvas work jacket and a self-satisfied expression, was a man I had not seen before. He was maybe mid-60s, heavy-set, with the weathered look of someone who had spent decades working outdoors. Douglas Thornton, Heather's husband. I recognized him from the property records I had pulled at the county office. I stopped my truck and got out. Douglas did not move from his position in front of the gate. "Can I help you?" he asked, though his tone made clear he had no intention of helping anyone. "That is my bridge," I said, "and my property on the other side." Douglas shook his head slowly. "Mrs. Thornton says you have not paid your fees. The bridge is closed until you settle your account." I felt the anger rising in my chest, but I kept my voice level. "There is no account. There is no legitimate fee. That organization does not legally exist, and you are blocking access to private property." Douglas shrugged, unmoved. "Take it up with the community coordinator. Until then, the bridge stays closed." He patted the gate like it was a loyal dog. "I installed this myself, good and solid. You will not be moving it without the key." I stood there for a long moment, looking at the gate, then at Douglas, then at my bridge beyond. The bridge I had spent 6 weeks building. The bridge connected the county road to 45 acres of land that belonged to me. now blocked by a man who had no legal right to be there, enforcing rules created by his wife for an organization that did not exist. The absurdity of it was almost overwhelming, but underneath the absurdity was something more serious. This was not just a toll scam anymore. This was an obstruction of access. This was using physical barriers to prevent a property owner from reaching his own land. This was, potentially, criminal. Let me ask you something directly. What would you do at this moment? Your property is right there, 100 feet away. The only thing between you and your land is a metal gate installed by a man with no authority to install it. Would you remove the barricade yourself? Cut the chain and drive through? That option crossed my mind. It would feel satisfying for about 30 seconds. Then I would be the one who damaged property, even if the property was illegally placed on my land. Douglas would call the sheriff. Heather would claim I was violent, dangerous, a threat to the community. Whatever case I was building would be compromised by my own actions. That is exactly what they were counting on. Push me until I react. Make me the aggressor. Turn the victim into the villain. I did not touch the gate. I did not argue further with Douglas. I took out my phone and photographed everything. The barricade, the sign, the padlock. Douglas was standing there with his arms crossed. The timestamp on each photo. The GPS coordinates are embedded in the metadata. Then I walked around the barricade, crossed the bridge on foot, and continued to my property. Douglas watched me go but did not try to stop me. Pedestrians were apparently still allowed, as long as they did not bring vehicles, as long as they did not try to actually live on or develop their own land. I spent that afternoon sitting on my half-finished cabin porch, looking at Crystal Lake and making phone calls. The first call was to an attorney named Rachel Summers, whose name had come up in my research as someone who specialized in property disputes and land access issues. The second call was to the Pitkin County Sheriff's Office, requesting information about how to file a formal complaint for obstruction of property access. The third call was to Elena Ruiz, asking her to spread the word to the other property owners I had spoken with. I wanted them to know what Heather and Douglas had done. I wanted them to know that the Thorntons were not just collecting fake fees anymore. They were physically preventing people from accessing their own land. This was no longer just about money. This was about power. And the Thorntons had just made a very serious mistake. They had turned a fraud investigation into something much bigger, something that would be much harder to ignore, something that would bring attention from people with actual authority. They just did not know it yet. Rachel Summers had an office in a converted Victorian house on the outskirts of Aspen. The waiting room was decorated with framed photographs of Colorado landscapes, and the receptionist offered me coffee before showing me into a conference room where Rachel was already reviewing the documents I had emailed the night before. She was younger than I expected, maybe early 40s, with sharp eyes and the kind of focused energy that comes from handling disputes where precision matters. She had spread my materials across the conference table: deed, plat maps, photographs of the barricade, copies of invoices from Elena and Walter. The threatening letter demanded $1,200. She looked up when I entered and gestured for me to sit down. "Mr. Cross, I have been doing property law in this county for 15 years. I thought I had seen everything. But this..." She tapped the stack of documents. "This is something else." She walked me through her analysis methodically. The plat maps confirmed what I already knew. My property encompassed both sides of Pine Creek at the bridge crossing. The bridge was built entirely on land I owned. There were no easements granting any organization access rights or management authority. The county road ended at my property line, with a 30-foot public easement for road maintenance. But that easement did not extend to private structures like bridges. "The Elk Ridge Community Fund has no legal standing to collect fees from you or anyone else," Rachel said. "It is not a registered nonprofit. It is not a special district. It is not a homeowners association with recorded covenants. It is just a name on a piece of paper. A name that Heather Thornton uses to give her collection activities an appearance of legitimacy. For those who do not understand how property fees work in Colorado, let me explain what Rachel told me. To legally collect maintenance fees for roads or bridges, you need to be one of three things: a government entity with statutory authority, like a county or special district; a registered nonprofit or homeowners association with recorded covenants that property owners have agreed to when purchasing their land; or a private owner with explicit easement agreements signed by the people using your infrastructure. Heather Thornton was none of these. She had no government authority. She had no registered organization. She had no signed agreements. What she had been doing for 10 years was not community management. It was fraud, collecting money under pretenses for services that were never provided and authority that never existed. Rachel recommended a two-step approach. First, she would send a formal cease and desist letter to Heather Thornton, demanding immediate removal of the barricade and cessation of all fee collection activities. Second, she would file a complaint with the Pitkin County Sheriff's Office documenting the obstruction of access to my property. That should be enough to stop her, Rachel said. Once she realizes there is legal pushback, she will likely back down. People who run schemes like this depend on nobody fighting back. I nodded but did not respond immediately. I was thinking about the 8 families who had paid her for years. About Walter Jensen, who had watched his money disappear into a fund that supposedly could not afford to repair a 30-foot bridge. About Tom Bradshaw, who had been driven out of the community for asking questions. Stopping Heather was not enough. I wanted restitution for the people she had victimized. I wanted the community to understand what had been happening in their midst. I want more than a cease, I said finally. I want a full accounting of every dollar she has collected. I want every victim to have the opportunity to recover what they paid. And I want this exposed publicly, so she cannot just quietly shut down and start over somewhere else. Rachel studied me for a moment, then nodded slowly. That is a bigger fight, but it is possible. If we can document the full scope of her activities and get enough victims to come forward, we might be able to pursue civil action for fraud and theft by deception. And if the evidence is strong enough, the district attorney might take an interest. She paused. But there is something else you should know. Something I found while researching the Thorntons. She pulled up a document on her laptop and turned the screen toward me. It was a campaign finance report from 2 years ago for a county council candidate named Peter Hayes. Among the listed donors was an organization called Elk Ridge Community Initiative. I had never heard of it. But the registered agent for that organization, according to the Colorado Secretary of State database, was Douglas Thornton. Peter Hayes won that election, Rachel said. He is currently on the county council, and according to these records, the Thorntons have donated over $8,000 to his campaigns over the past 5 years through this PAC. I stared at the screen, processing the implications. Heather collected money from residents through a fake community fund. Douglas channeled some of that money into a political action committee. The PAC donated to a county council member who had been conspicuously unresponsive to complaints about the Thorntons for years. It was a closed loop, a self-protecting system where the fraud funded the political cover that allowed the fraud to continue. They have been doing this for a long time, I said quietly. And they have been protecting themselves at every step. Rachel nodded. Which means we need to be careful. Hayes influences this county. If he sees this as a threat to himself, he might try to interfere. But it also means that when this comes out, it will be bigger than just one woman collecting fake fees. It will be a corruption story, and corruption stories attract attention. She closed her laptop and looked at me directly. Are you prepared for this to get public? Because once we start down this road, there is no going back quietly. I thought about Crystal Lake, about my half-finished cabin, about the peace I had come to Elk Ridge to find. Then I thought about Elena, who had paid $12,000 for nothing, about Walter, who had watched his community get exploited for decades, about Tom Bradshaw, who had been forced out for asking the questions everyone should have been asking. "Yes," I said. "I am prepared. Let us do this right." That evening, I drove to Elena's farm and told her everything Rachel had uncovered. She listened in silence as I explained the connection between the Thorntons and Councilman Hayes. When I finished, she sat very still for a long moment. Then she looked up at me with an expression I had not seen before. Not anger, not resignation, something closer to resolving. For 5 years, I told myself it was just how things worked here, that questioning it would cause more trouble than it was worth. But it was never about community. It was about them, taking from us and protecting themselves. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at her fields. "I want to help. Whatever you need, documents, testimony, anything. I am done being quiet. And I think the others will feel the same way once they know the truth." The Thornton residence sat at the end of Mountain View Lane, a winding private road that climbed through dense pine forest before opening onto a clearing with views of the entire valley. Rachel Summers drove while I reviewed the cease and desist letter one more time in the passenger seat. We had discussed the approach beforehand. Deliver the letter in person. Give Heather a chance to respond. Document everything. Do not engage in argument. Do not make threats. Just present the facts and leave. Simple in theory. But as we pulled up to the house, I felt my jaw tighten. This was the woman who had been stealing from my neighbors for a decade. The woman who had blocked access to my own property. The woman had built a small empire of petty corruption in a community where people just wanted to live in peace. The house was larger than I expected. A sprawling log and stone structure that looked like it belonged in an architectural magazine. Not tucked away on a mountain road in rural Colorado. 3-car garage. A boat trailer was parked beside it with a fishing boat that probably cost more than most people's annual salary. A hot tub is visible on the back deck. Solar panels on the roof. Every detail screamed money. Money that had come, at least in part, from the $120,000 she had collected from her neighbors over the past decade. I thought about Elena's farmhouse, modest and practical, built with years of hard work. About Walter's small cabin, where an old man lived alone on a fixed income. About all the people who had paid Heather Thornton for services that did not exist, while she used their money to build herself this monument to unchecked greed. Rachel parked in the circular driveway, and we walked to the front door together. I rang the bell. There was movement behind the frosted glass, and then the door opened. Heather Thornton stood in the doorway wearing a cashmere sweater and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. Her expression shifted the moment she recognized me. The pleasant curiosity vanished, replaced by something cold and guarded. "Mr. Cross, I was not expecting you." Her eyes moved to Rachel. "And you are—" Rachel handed her a business card. "Rachel Summers, attorney at law. I represent Mr. Cross in a matter concerning your activities as the self-described community coordinator of Elk Ridge." Heather looked at the card, then back at us. "I do not have time for this. Whatever you are selling, I am not interested." She started to close the door. "Mrs. Thornton," Rachel said, her voice calm but firm, "we are here to deliver a formal cease and desist letter. You can accept it now, or we can have it delivered by certified mail and a process server. Your choice." Heather paused. The door half closed. For a moment, I thought she would slam it in our faces. Then she opened it again and extended her hand. Rachel gave her the envelope. Heather tore it open and scanned the contents while we waited in silence. The letter laid out everything. The demand is to immediately remove the barricade from my bridge. The demand to cease all fee collection activities related to the Elk Ridge Community Fund. The notice stated that the fund was not a registered legal entity and had no authority to collect fees or restrict access to private property. the warning that continued activities would result in civil and potentially criminal action. Heather finished reading and looked up at me with an expression I can only describe as contempt. "You think you are clever, do you not? Coming here with your lawyer and your threats? I have been managing this community for 25 years. 25 years of keeping the roads clear, the bridges maintained, the neighborhood safe. And you waltz in, some outsider from Denver, and think you can tell me how things work?" She stepped closer, her voice dropping to something between a hiss and a whisper. "I know everyone in this county. I know people on the council. I know people in the sheriff's office. You have no idea what you are getting yourself into." I met her gaze without flinching. "I know that your community fund does not exist as a legal entity. I know that the fees you collect go to a P.O. box registered to this address. And I know that the bridge you are charging people to cross is a bridge I built with my own hands, on my own property, after the old one collapsed because you failed to maintain it despite collecting maintenance fees for 10 years. Her face flushed red. "You are slandering me. I will sue you for defamation. I will make sure everyone in Elk Ridge knows what kind of person you really are." Rachel stepped in smoothly. "Mrs. Thornton, I would advise you to consult with your own attorney before making any further statements. Everything said here today is being documented. If you continue to obstruct Mr. Cross's access to his property, we will pursue all available legal remedies, including filing complaints with the county sheriff, the district attorney, and potentially federal authorities if fraud across county lines can be established." Heather glared at Rachel, then at me. "Get off my property, both of you, now!" We turned and walked back to the car without another word. As we drove away, I looked back at the house in the side mirror. Heather was still standing in the doorway, watching us go. You might be wondering why I did not try to negotiate. Why did I not offer some kind of compromise that might have resolved the situation without further conflict? The answer is simple. You cannot negotiate with someone who is extorting you. Compromise requires good faith on both sides. Heather Thornton had demonstrated nothing but bad faith from the moment I met her. She was not interested in community management. She was interested in control and money. Any compromise I offered would simply be interpreted as weakness, an invitation to push harder. The only language people like her understand is consequences, legal consequences, public consequences. The kind of consequences that cannot be avoided by knowing the right people or making the right donations. We were about half a mile from the Thornton property when I noticed a county sheriff's vehicle parked at a turnout along the road. As we passed, the driver's door opened, and a deputy stepped out, raising his hand to flag us down. Rachel pulled over. The deputy walked up to her window. He was maybe late 30s, Latino, with a calm and professional demeanor. His nameplate said Torres. "Mrs. Summers, Mr. Cross." He looked at both of us in turn. "I am Deputy Mike Torres with the Pitkin County Sheriff's Office. I have been hearing some things about a dispute involving a bridge and an organization called the Elk Ridge Community Fund. I was hoping I could ask you a few questions." I looked at Rachel. She nodded slightly. "Of course, Deputy," I said. "I would be happy to tell you everything I know." For the first time since this whole mess began, I felt like someone with actual authority was finally paying attention. The quarterly town hall meeting was held in the community center on the first Thursday of October, a modest building with fluorescent lights and folding chairs arranged in neat rows. I arrived early with Elena, Walter Jensen, and 4 other property owners who had agreed to speak. Rachel Summers sat in the back, observing but not participating. This was our moment, not hers. The room filled slowly, maybe 40 residents in total, and there, in the front row, sat Heather Thornton in a navy blazer, looking every bit the community leader she pretended to be. Douglas sat beside her, arms crossed. Councilman Peter Hayes was at the table up front with 2 other council members, shuffling papers and avoiding eye contact with the audience. When the public comment period opened, I stood up first. I walked to the microphone and introduced myself calmly. Then I began presenting what I had found. The plat maps showing my bridge were entirely on my property. The Secretary of State records show no organization called Elk Ridge Community Fund existed. The P.O. box is registered to Heather Thornton's personal address. The invoices that 8 families had been paying for years, with no services rendered. I spoke for exactly 5 minutes. No emotion, just facts. When I finished, Elena stood up. Then Walter. Then the Hendersons. One by one. They shared what they had paid. How long had they paid it? What they had received in return. Nothing. The room grew quiet. People were looking at Heather now. Looking at her in a way they had not before. Councilman Hayes tried to interrupt. This is not the appropriate forum for what sounds like a civil dispute between private parties. I turned to face him directly. Councilman Hayes, public records show that you have received over $8,000 in campaign donations from an organization called Elk Ridge Community Initiative. That organization was registered by Douglas Thornton, Mrs. Thornton's husband. You have a conflict of interest in this matter and should recuse yourself from any discussion. The room erupted in murmurs. Hayes's face went pale. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. That was when Heather stood up. Her composure had cracked. Her face was flushed, her voice rising. You people are ungrateful. All of you. I have given 25 years to this community. 25 years of keeping things running while you all sat in your cabins and did nothing. And this is how you repay me, by listening to some outsider who has been here for 6 months. She pointed at me. He does not belong here. He does not understand how things work. I built this community. I made it what it is. And now you want to tear it all down because of what some paperwork? The room was silent now. Everyone watching. Everyone is seeing the mask slip away. You think you can survive without me? Fine. Try it. See what happens when no one is managing your roads, your bridges, your access. You will come crawling back. You always do. Deputy Torres, who had been standing quietly near the exit, stepped forward and approached Heather. Mrs. Thornton, I think it would be best if you came with me to answer some questions. Heather stared at him in disbelief. You cannot be serious. Do you know who I am? Torres nodded calmly. Yes, ma'am, I do. That is why I need you to come with me. He did not touch her. He did not raise his voice. He simply waited. After a long moment, Heather picked up her purse and walked toward the door, Douglas following behind her. The room remained silent until they were gone. Walter Jensen rose slowly from his chair, using his cane for support. The room turned to look at him. His voice was quiet but carried to every corner. I have lived here for 50 years. I watched Heather Thornton build her little kingdom one lie at a time. I never said anything because I thought no one would believe me, because I was afraid. He paused, looking around the room at his neighbors. But tonight, I saw something I have not seen in a long time. People are standing up. People telling the truth. And I want you all to know, it is not too late. It is never too late to do the right thing. The investigation moved faster than I expected. Deputy Torres had been gathering information quietly for weeks before the town hall meeting, waiting for enough victims to come forward before taking official action. My documentation, combined with statements from Elena, Walter, and 6 other property owners, gave the sheriff's office everything they needed. 3 days after Heather's public meltdown, the Pitkin County Sheriff announced a formal investigation into the Elk Ridge Community Fund for suspected fraud, theft by deception, and extortion. The announcement made the local news. By the end of the week, It had been picked up by outlets in Denver and Colorado Springs. A small-town corruption story with all the right elements. A fake community organization. Over $100,000 in collected fees. A political connection to a sitting county councilman. The kind of story that writes itself. Rachel Summers coordinated with the district attorney's office to ensure that the civil complaints we had prepared would complement the criminal investigation rather than interfere with it. The DA was interested. Very interested. White-collar crime cases often fall through the cracks because they are complicated and time-consuming. But this one had clear documentation, multiple victims willing to testify, and a paper trail that led directly to Heather Thornton's personal bank account. The forensic accountant the DA hired found that over 10 years, the so-called Elk Ridge Community Fund had collected approximately $127,000 from 12 families. Of that amount, exactly zero had been spent on road maintenance, bridge repair, or any other community infrastructure. The money had gone to the Thorntons' personal expenses, mortgage payments on their mountain home, a boat, 2 vehicles, vacation travel. They had been living off their neighbors for a decade. You might be wondering whether the Thorntons would find a way to escape consequences. People with connections often do. They hire expensive lawyers. They delay proceedings. They negotiate plea deals that amount to slaps on the wrist. I wondered the same thing. But here is the difference between typical corruption and what Heather Thornton had built. She had victimized too many people for too long. The evidence was too clear, and she had made the critical mistake of threatening people publicly, on the record, in front of witnesses. Her outburst at the town hall was captured on video by 3 different residents. Her threats against me during our confrontation at her home had been documented in Rachel's notes. Every time she had opened her mouth to defend herself, she had only made things worse. The charges came down 6 weeks after the town hall meeting. Heather Thornton was charged with 12 counts of theft by deception, 1 for each family she had defrauded. She was also charged with 1 count of extortion for the physical barricade she had ordered Douglas to install on my bridge. Douglas Thornton faced charges of conspiracy and criminal obstruction of property access. The barricade itself had been removed by the sheriff's office within 48 hours of the town hall. But the criminal liability remained. Travis Brooks, the handyman who had allegedly been performing maintenance work for years, was questioned, but not charged. He admitted that Heather had paid him small amounts to occasionally clear brush along the roads, but nothing close to the scope of work that would justify the fees she had been collecting. He had been a pawn, not a partner. Councilman Peter Hayes resigned from the county council 2 weeks before the charges were announced. The official statement cited personal reasons and a desire to spend more time with family. The unofficial truth, which everyone in the county understood, was that an ethics investigation had been opened into his relationship with the Thorntons and their political action committee. The donations from Elk Ridge Community Initiative had not been illegal on their face, but the timing and amounts raised serious questions about whether Hayes had deliberately ignored complaints about the Thorntons in exchange for campaign support. His political career was over, even if he never faced formal charges. The morning after the charges were announced, I drove up to my property for the first time in weeks without feeling a knot in my stomach. The bridge was clear. No signs, no barricades. No one was standing guard with a clipboard demanding money for something they had no right to charge for. I parked my truck on my own land and walked to the edge of Crystal Lake. The water was still. The mountains reflected perfectly on the surface. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, I felt like I could breathe. A few days later, I received a call from a man named James Porter. He had been considering buying property in Elk Ridge 2 years ago, but had walked away after hearing about the mandatory community fees. "I thought something was wrong with that setup," he said. "But I did not want to buy into a situation where I would be fighting with neighbors from day one, so I just left." He paused. "Now I am reading about what happened, about the fraud charges, about all those families who got taken. His voice was quiet, but steady. "I wanted to thank you, not just for yourself, but for everyone who will come after. You made this place safe for people like me. People who just want to own a piece of land and be left alone. That matters more than you know." The trials concluded 8 months after the charges were filed. Heather Thornton pleaded not guilty to all counts and insisted on taking her case before a jury. It was a miscalculation. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank records showing deposits from 12 families over 10 years, invoices with no corresponding services, a P.O. box registered to her home address, testimony from victim after victim, each telling the same story of fees paid for maintenance that never happened. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all 12 counts of theft by deception and the single count of extortion. The judge, noting the duration of the scheme, the number of victims, and Heather's complete lack of remorse throughout the proceedings, sentenced her to 3 years in state prison. She would be eligible for parole after serving 1 year, contingent on full cooperation with restitution efforts. She was also permanently barred from holding any fiduciary or management position in any community organization, homeowners association, or nonprofit entity in the state of Colorado. Douglas Thornton took a different path. His attorney negotiated a plea deal in exchange for testimony about the full scope of the operation. He pleaded guilty to conspiracy and obstruction of property access. The judge sentenced him to 2 years of probation and 300 hours of community service. Real community service. Supervised by the county. Not the imaginary kind his wife had been billing people for. As part of the plea agreement, Douglas was required to sell the fishing boat and one of their vehicles to contribute to the restitution fund. He and Heather divorced while she was awaiting trial. Last I heard, he had moved to a small apartment in Grand Junction and was working as a handyman. The irony was not lost on anyone. Councilman Peter Hayes never faced criminal charges, but his political career ended definitively. The ethics investigation found that while his acceptance of campaign donations from the Thorntons' PAC was not technically illegal, he had failed to disclose a personal relationship with the Thornton family and had deliberately ignored multiple complaints about the Elk Ridge Community Fund over 5 years. He was censured by the county council and barred from seeking elected office in Pitkin County for 10 years. His name was quietly removed from a community recreation center that had been dedicated in his honor 3 years earlier. The plaque was replaced with one honoring a retired school teacher who had spent 40 years educating children in the county, a better use of the wall space. The restitution process took longer than the trials. Forensic accountants traced every dollar that had flowed through the fake community fund and calculated what each family was owed. The total came to $127,000, plus interest. Heather's assets were seized and liquidated. The mountain home on Mountain View Lane sold for just under $800,000. After paying off the mortgage and legal fees, there was enough to cover full restitution for all 12 families. Elena Ruiz received a check for $12,400. Walter Jensen received $8,000. Even Tom Bradshaw, who had moved to Arizona 3 years earlier, received the nearly $10,000 he had paid before being driven out of the community. I called him when the check arrived. He was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "I never thought I would see that money again," he said. "But it is not really about the money, is it? It is about knowing that what happened to me mattered, that someone finally did something about it." The community began to heal in ways I had not anticipated. The quarterly town hall meetings continued, but the atmosphere was different now. People spoke up. They asked questions. They demanded transparency from county officials in a way they never had before. A new informal association was formed, not to collect fees or enforce arbitrary rules, but to coordinate actual maintenance efforts. Neighbors helping neighbors, shared equipment for road clearing after storms, a volunteer schedule for checking on elderly residents during harsh winters, the kind of community organization that Heather had pretended to run but never actually created. Elena became one of the informal leaders of this effort. She told me once that losing $12,000 to a fraud had taught her something valuable. "I learned that silence is expensive," she said. "Speaking up costs less in the long run." 1 year after the town hall meeting where everything came to a head, I finished my cabin. The last piece was the front porch, wide enough for 2 rocking chairs and a view of Crystal Lake that still takes my breath away every morning. I had come to Elk Ridge looking for peace, for a place to build something of my own after 15 years of building things for other people. I found something else instead. A fight I never asked for. A community that needed someone to stand up. A reminder that the systems we take for granted only work when people are willing to defend them. The bridge still stands at the entrance to my property. 30 feet of engineered timber spanning Pine Creek, built with my own hands during 6 weeks of work that now feel like they happened in another lifetime. There is no toll sign anymore, no barricade, no clipboard-wielding gatekeeper demanding payment for passage. Just a bridge, connecting the county road to 45 acres of mountain land that belongs to me. Anyone who drives across it now does so freely, the way it should have been from the beginning. Walter Jensen passed away peacefully in his sleep last spring, 2 months after receiving his restitution check. He was 79 years old. At his memorial service, held in the same community center where we had confronted Heather Thornton. Elena read a letter he had written to be shared after his death. In it, he said that the last year of his life had been the happiest he could remember. Not because of the money, because for the first time in decades, he felt like he lived in a community where people looked out for each other instead of looking the other way. "I spent too many years being afraid to speak," he wrote, "but I learned at the end that it is never too late to find your voice. And once you find it, you realize it was there all along. You just had to decide to use it." I think about those words sometimes, sitting on my porch in the early morning, watching the mist rise off Crystal Lake. I think about all the people who paid Heather Thornton for years because they assumed someone with a clipboard and an official-sounding title must have authority. I think about how easy it is to comply with things that feel wrong, simply because compliance is easier than conflict. And I think about what changes when one person decides to ask why. Not with anger, not with violence, just with patience, documentation, and an unwillingness to accept that the way things are is the way things have to be. If you have stayed with this story until the end, thank you. Heather Thornton spent 10 years collecting money from her neighbors for services she never provided, protected by the assumption that no one would ever challenge her. What brought her down was not wealth or political power or legal expertise. It was documentation, patience, a willingness to ask questions and follow the answers wherever they led. If you are dealing with someone like Heather Thornton in your own life, someone who claims authority they do not have, who demands compliance based on rules they invented, who counts on your silence to continue their scheme, I want you to know something. You do not need to be a lawyer or an engineer, or a sheriff to fight back. You just need to start with what you know. Document everything, and trust that the truth, once exposed to daylight, has a way of doing the rest. This has been Fallout HOA. I will see you in the next one.